of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Chicago. I am particularly pleased today to introduce three distinguished scholars on Hanafism to talk to us about this topic on the topic of Hadith and Hanafism. The three speakers we have today are Dr. Issam Eido from Vanderbilt University, Dr. Junaid Qadri from the University of Illinois here in Chicago, and Dr. Suhail Hanif from the Cambridge Muslim College. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming. Welcome to all of those who have joined us for this session from locally and internationally. And I'm really looking forward to this event. The format will be that we're going to have three presentations back to back. Then we will have Q&A in which you can either type your questions into the chat box or raise your hand and ask your question in person. So that feature of asking the question will be enabled after the three talks are completed. Otherwise, let's move right to the topic. We will start with Issam Eido, who is going to talk to us about Usul al-Qiyaas versus Usul al-Kalam, Hadith criticism in early history of Islam. Dr. Eido, please.
Thank you. So I want to be sure I share my screen. Is my screen visible? Do you see my screen? Okay, that's good. Okay, so let me enlarge that. Okay, so first I would like to thank the CMES and Globals Academies team for organizing this panel. Special thanks to Dr. Ahmed Shamsi, Mimi Kirk, and Thomas for organizing and hosting. Before addressing the main topic, I would like to give a brief background of the contemporary debate on the subject. According to Christopher Milchart, the big loss occurred in the history of Hadith criticism was the purity and power of simply letting Hadith speak for itself. After a comprehensive reading of Hadith criticism and Hadith corpus in the early history of Islam, Mutaqaddimin, one comes to realize that the early period witnessed a big and sophisticated debate on how Muslim scholars verify Hadith or how they approach Hadith related to legal or theological contents. Do they approach it as a living report or non-living? Or do they approach it through the lens of authenticity or epistemology? Traditionalists, or the people of Hadith normativity, a term I borrowed from Shihab Ahmed's legal normativity and used by Robert Gleave in his recent article, Shia's Law, Islamic Law, Some Categories Problems. These people addressed the matter through three methodological Okay, so this is a slide I'm talking right now. So these people address the matter through three methodological aspects: isnad criticism, separating reports, riwayah, from action, amal, or opinion, ra'i, and considering probability as an epistemological rank for acting and practicing upon reports. If that's right, then the general picture for the report in the lens of this camp is a non-living report. Rationalists or epistemologists, on another hand, developed non-isnad tools for Hadith criticism, as we will see later, attaching report to action, amal, or belief, i'tiqad, and seeking, in particular in Mu'tazilites, literature for certainty as an epistemological rank for accepting Hadith. The latter camp was mostly adopted by Mu'tazili theologians, Mutakallimin, and Hanafi jurists, fuqaha, who are part of larger societies and politics. According to Yusuf Rappaport's interview with Harvard Islamic Law blog, law is not theology or philosophy. Law is about how people live. It can be said here, theology or kalam is another aspect of how people politically and societally live in the early period of Islam, and how they, Mu'tazili figures in particular, established and shaped the concept of justice, al-adl, in their societies. And you know that they called al-Adliyun, and that we can witness that this name in the Fadl al-I'tizal, al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar. In this context, law or theology should be considered a lived law or theology. Accordingly, reports used by jurists or theologians should be approached as a lived report. In other words, the debate in the formative period was on how we give birth or life to report. Those reports used in public courts and political and societal realms are living reports or receiving birth certificate. And those who did not have an access to public are on the waiting list of birth certificate, and they can be activated in any moment in history, as we see in Suhail's Hanif study on how Rumelian and Egyptian Hanafi in medieval times approach Hadith. So let me start with the main topic and the title of this presentation, Usul al-Qiyaas and Usul al-Kalam, and the best translation I come to for this two technical terms. We can say legal canons for Usul al-Qiyaas and theological canons for Usul al-Kalam. After a comprehensive reading of the early Hanafi and Mu'tazili writings, I come to realize that both Hanafi and Mu'tazili schools had applied multiple tools in order to verify hadith. The pinnacle of these tools is two technical terms can be depicted as an umbrella for their complicated methods of hadith criticism. The first term is Usul al-Kalam. So Usul al-Kalam, mentioned by Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi, as we will see later. Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi died 319, and he mentions that in his book Qabul al-Akhbar, which is a book, the subject of this book about hadith criticism is not about kalam or about legal theory. And Usul al-Qiyaas, mentioned by Abu Zayd al-Dabusi, died 430 in his book Ta'sis al-Nazar, and the book considered as a main source for legal theory. So there are two different realms for these books. The first one about hadith criticism, and the second one about legal theory. And the first technical term by Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi is Usul al-Qiyas, and the second one Usul al-Kalam. And as I said, these two technical terms can be considered an umbrella or a general methodology for their sophisticated and complicated approach towards hadith criticism. So in this text from from Kitab Qabul al-Akhbar by Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi, we can see very clearly that al-Balkhi mentioned Usul al-Kalam in his very brief introduction, around just like 2-3 pages in his book Qabul al-Akhbar, and he mentioned in this paragraph وتعلم أيضا أن أصول الكلام المجتمع عليها. So he mentioned here أصول الكلام, and then you can see underline words الأمر العام, the public affairs, and then الفروع is just like مسائل الفقهية. So he categorized مسائل الدين into 3 main topics or categories. The first one أصول الكلام, the second one الأمر العام, and the third one الفروع. And we'll see later what he means by أصول الكلام. So this is about Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi. So let us move to Abu Zayd al-Dabusi. In his book تأسيس النظر, we can see he mentioned 2 technical terms. The first one al-usul, and he mentioned in later, and especially in Hanafi school, so referring to al-Usul here as Usul al-Qiyas in Hanafi literature and also non-Hanafi literature, and especially in Kitab al-Mu'tamad by Abu al-Hussein al-Basri, when he referring to al-Dabusi and Hanafi school, referring to them with the technical term Usul al-Qiyas. So here Abu Zayd al-Dabusi differentiate between two technical terms. The first one al-Usul and the second one Qiyas al-Usul. And he mentioned here al-Asl, this like different meaning from al-Usul here. Al-Asl here mean the foundation or the rules that our fellows followed. So he considered al-Usul al-Qiyas an umbrella for their hadith criticism and for all non-isnad tools, as we will see later. So becoming 5 tools by al-Jassas. So however, the best translation I reach for these two technical terms, al-Usul, Usul al-Qiyas and Qiyas al-Usul. So Usul al-Qiyas can be considered as canons, but Qiyas al-Usul can considered as text. So canons here could be textual canons or non-textual canons, as you can see in contemporary literature. So we can be like Muslim textbooks or Usul al-Fiqh, they use al-Qawa'id al-Fiqhiyya and al-Qawa'id al-Shar'iyya. So let us move to Mu'tazili, and here we can see diagram showing us the main isnad of Mu'tazila, as is mentioned by Ibn al-Murtada, Kitab Tabaqat al-Mu'tazila. And the main isnad here include the main figures of Mu'tazila coming from Ali bin Abi Talib and end with al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar in the mid of the 5th Islamic century. So the black line represents the early I'tizal, and the blue one represents the late Mu'tazila. So in this tree, we can see the absence of, notice the absence of al-Jahiz and the Nadam, and the absence of Baghdadi school in the late era. So in the late era, we just witnessed Basri schools, no one from Baghdadi school, as we will see later in another map. And the isnad ends with al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar and start with the Prophet's family. So here is just to expand the tree or diagram. So the black line represents the early Mu'tazila, and then these two colored lines or two colored branches represent Baghdadi and Basri. Here Basri, and here Baghdadi. Baghdadi starts with Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi, and the Basri one start with Abu Ali al-Jubba'i. So as we can see in some secondary sources on Mu'tazila, especially what Rashid al-Umari and Joseph Van Es wrote on Mu'tazila, so they divided the history of I'tizal in two main stages. The first one early and late, and a third school can be added. This can be considered al-Madrasiyya, or the merge between Ash'arites and Mu'tazilites, especially in the writings of Abu al-Hussein al-Basri in his book Kitab al-Mu'tamad. So each single figure here represents his tasawwur, his perspective on hadith criticism, as we will see later. But there are main figures here. I just mentioned al-Khayyat, and then Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi, since al-Khayyat is the teacher of Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi, and Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi also wrote his book Qabul al-Akhbar as a rebuttal work on al-Khayyat. And then the main figures here in the Basri school, al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar and al-Jubba'i, and their works rebutted by Abu al-Hussein al-Basri in his book al-Mu'tamad. So this a very early text by Wasif bin Ata, mentioned by al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar in his book Kitab Fadl al-I'tizal. In this 3 lines, we can notice very important things. The first one, maybe the first slide represents the early definition of what's called later المتواتر, الحديث المتواتر. كل خبر لا يمكن فيه التواطؤ والتراسل والاتفاق على غير التواطؤ فهو حجة. So he did not mention al-tawatur, he mentioned hujjah, and this hujjah, a technical term used by al-Shafi'i in his book Kitab Jima' al-Ilm and al-Risala, when he referring to hadith or khabar al-ahad or khabar al-tawatur. So they did not mention sahih or other terms used later. They use the word hujjah. So at-tawatur is the hidden correspondence or hidden agreement among narrators to narrate any hadith. And then he mentioned three technical or three non-isnad tools to criticize hadith. The first one, Kitabullah, and the second one, Khabarun Ja'a Maji al-Hujjah, and the third one, Aql Salim. So three non-isnad tools for Wasil bin Ata to criticize any hadith, or is just like a standard or background to criticize any hadith. The first one, Kitabullah, and the second one, Al-Khabar alladhi ja'a maji al-Hujjah. That means that any authoritative khabar, and Aql Salim, sound reasoning. So these three non-isnad tools expanded later with, but mostly all Mu'tazila after that agreed upon, but they expand and added one or two tools to these three tools. So here in, just return back to Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi, we can see the numbers represent the final five non-isnad tools by Mu'tazila to criticize hadith. The first one, Kitabullah, same as you can see in Wasil bin Ata. And the second one, Sunnat Rasulillah al-Mujma' alayha. So in Wasil bin Ata, we can see Khabar Ja'a Maji al-Hujjah, but here Sunnah that agreed upon among Muslim societies or Muslim scholars. And the third one, Ijma' al-Ummah, the agreement of nation, or yes. And the fourth one, Amal al-Sadr al-Awwal, the praxis of the first generation. And the fifth one, al-Aql. And here in this text, there is something like very important related to Usul al-Kalam. When he mentioned at-Tawheed wal-Adl, these Usul al-Kalam for Mu'tazila. We know that there are five principles for Mu'tazila, but at-Tawheed wal-Adl becoming the most important principles for Mu'tazila, and then they are known by al-Adliyun or by al-Qadariyah, or Ahl al-Adl wa Tawheed. These are the most important principles for Mu'tazila, and this Usul al-Kalam used as an umbrella or as a tool to criticize any hadith. So any hadith agree with these principles, this hadith could hujjah, and then any hadith, even though mutawatir, if not agree with these two principles, should be reinterpreted or giving another interpretation, a different interpretation, or an interpretation fits with these two principles. And if that's khabar al-wahid, that's for sure, of course, would be maybe rejected. Here, a chart represents the five, we can see here, five non-isnad tools by Mu'tazila. So all of these five mentioned by al-Balkhi, but some of them mentioned by, so three of them mentioned by al-Khayyat, Quran, Sunnah, and Ijma'. And al-Jubba'i mentioned three. He did not mention Sunnah, but he mentioned Amal al-Sadr al-Awwal. And then Qadi Abdul Jabbar mentioned everything, but he did not mention Amal al-Sadr al-Awwal. Abu Hussein al-Basri did not mention Amal al-Sadr al-Awwal. Let us move to Hanafi school. As we can see in Mu'tazila, the umbrella to criticize hadith is Usul al-Kalam, and presented five non-isnad tools by Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi. And as we can see here, we have five non-isnad tools, and maybe we can see a different or maybe same, as we will see later in Hanafi chart. So for Hanafis, they have a different route in terms of hadith criticism. So the court was the main reason or motivation for Hanafi for them to criticize hadith. And you can see around maybe 1 century or more, the Muslim history controlled by Hanafi court and by Hanafi judge, started by Abu Yusuf, who was known as Qadi al-Qudaa, the judge of judges. And then after this 1 century and 2 decades, so we can witness other Qudat, other judges from different schools, coming from Shafi'i school, and then Mu'tazili, Zahiri, and Maliki. Ibn Surayj was the first judge among Shafi'i. and he criticized by his contemporary Ibn Khayran al-Baghdadi for taking this career, or for just like for working as a judge. He said this career was not a path or a way of our fellows, it's just a way of Hanafi school. And then we can see later, after just like 1 century after Ibn Surayj, al-Marwaruzi becoming the one who is advanced in the career of judgment, Sina'at al-Qudah. So that's this first century, and this from the second century, from the mid of the second century to maybe the mid of the third century, controlled by Hanafi school, and courts becoming a reason or motivation for Hanafi school to analyze hadith and to see the impact of hadith in the societies. Here a tree for Hanafi school, and we can see the main tree from like I work on this from Al-Fawaid al-Bahiyya and other resources on Hanafi biographies, Kutub al-Tabaqat. So the main figures here, or the blue line, represent the line of Usul al-Qiyas in Hanafi school, as we will see later, maybe with different terms for each figure here. So here's a tree, as we can see, here's a blue line here with the title and the career and what's the technical term used by each figure. So from Abu Hanifa, who reviews judgment, so there are 3 disciples, Zufar, Muhammad Hassan Shaybani, and Abu Yusuf. Both Abu Yusuf and Muhammad Hassan Shaybani were judged in the most important history in the second Islamic century. And Isa bin Aban also was judge, and then Abu Khazim Abdul Hamid also was judge of judges. And then from Abu Khazim we can see 2 branches, al-Karhi and al-Tahawi. And then al-Tahawi, the line stopped, and with al-Karhi we can see that we can track and trace the lines coming from Tujassas, and then Abu Ja'far and Abu Zayd Dabusi. Each one represents technical terms for Usul al-Qiyas. So Muhammad Hassan Shaybani, in his book Kitab al-Hujjah, we can see he used the word asl, he used many words referring to Usul al-Qiyas, and we can witness this book, or we can approach this book as a book of representing the coherent or consequential fiqh al-intizam. So that means we cannot take, or we cannot rely on any hadith without seeing this hadith fits with other hadith. And this is the main issue, or the main concern for Muhammad bin Hassan Shaybani when he debate and discuss the Ahl al-Madinah. So, and then with Isa bin Aban, al-Jassas used for Isa bin Aban this technical term, Tahkim al-Usul. And then for al-Tahawi, we can see al-Asl al-Jami'. This is a technical term used by al-Kawthari. Just al-Kawthari chooses this term to depict al-Tahawi works in his book Ma'ani al-Athar and Mushkil al-Athar. The technical term Usul al-Qiyas, we will see it in Abu Zayd Dabusi and later in Kutub al-Usul al-Hanafiyya and also Kutub al-Usul غير al-Hanafiyya, as I said previously in Kitab al-Mu'tamad Abu al-Hussein al-Basri. Here is another chart for Hanafi approach on Hadith criticism, and we can see non-isnad tools of Hadith criticism. So the blue lines here, Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani and Ibn Aban and al-Jassas agreed on five non-isnad tools. The first one, Quran, and the second one, established Sunnah or Sunnah Thabita. And the third one, Mujibat Ahkam al-Uqul, the general reasoning rulings. And the third one, Umum al-Balwa, public affairs. And the fifth one, Al-Amal bi Khilaf al-Hadith, as a tool to criticize any hadith. And the technical term used in Kutub al-Hanafiyya, al-Shadh or al-Shudud. This is a term used by Abu Yusuf and also used by Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani and in Kutub al-Usul al-Hanafiyya in later era. So however, so others like Zufar and Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf, maybe still we are in the time, we are discovering many manuscripts right now, and to discover the early resources and the early text mentioning all of these non-isnad tools in their books. But based on Kitab al-Hujjah, we can trace non-5 isnad tools as in his process and his debating with Ahl al-Madinah. But Isa bin Aban, these non-isnad tools mentioned by al-Jassas, and we know that Isa bin Aban is the main narrator of Kitab al-Hujjah by Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani. So again, this non-isnad tools represented by Hanafi schools. The first one established Sunnah Thabita, Quran, and public affairs, Umum al-Balwa, praxis, Shuzuz, and reasoning, Mujibat, Ahkam, al-Uqul. So I think this the final slide here representing both Hanafi and Mu'tazili school, and we can see the three lines here. The first one represents Ibn Aban, then al-Jassas, and then al-Balkhi. So al-Jassas al-Balkhi lived in the same time. Al-Jassas around, he lived maybe, he died 370 in the end of the 4th century, and al-Balkhi in the early of the 4th century, Ibn Aban in the beginning of the 3rd century. So we witnessed that all of these figures represented non-isnad tools to criticize hadith. All of these three figures agreed on 4 non-isnad tools. The first one, Quran; the second one, Sunnah; and then Aql and praxis, Amal al-Sadr al-Awwal. But then they disagree in two tools. But just I want to mention Sunnah. So for Ibn Aban, this like different for Ibn Aban and al-Jassas, the term used as Sunnah al-Thabita, but for al-Balkhi used as Sunnah al-Mujma' alayha. So here I think we need to maybe to study advanced study on what the meaning of what's the connotation of each technical terms here, what the meaning of Thabita and al-Mujma' alayha, are these same or not. So, and then for Ahkam al-Uqul, we can see here with Ibn Aban Mujibat Ahkam al-Uqul, but with al-Balkhi, just he said Ahkam al-Aql or al-Aql al-Salim. And then for Amal al-Sadr al-Awwal, yes, for Ibn Aban and Jassas mention al-Amal bil-Khilaf, Amal bi-Khilaf ma kana alayhi al-Sadr al-Awwal, and al-Balkhi Amal al-Sadr al-Awwal. And then we see like the two different tools for Ibn Aban and al-Jassas. The 5th tool is public affairs, Umum al-Balwa, but for al-Balkhi is al-Ijma', the agreement of Muslim community or Muslim scholars. So I don't know why is this different, but just like the initial thought, why al-Balkhi or maybe the Mu'tazilite school chose Ijma' not public affairs. Maybe this like more like giving more certainty, more qat'iyya for Usul al-Kalam, public affairs related to the courts and praxis and the people life in at that time. It's just like represent the two different realms, because public affairs related to furu', related to fiqh, related to legal issues, but ijma' related to Usul al-Kalam and theoretical issues. So I hope this can give a clear vision on these two technical terms as sophisticated, or maybe a general umbrella for a sophisticated method by Hanafi and Mu'tazili. Just I want to highlight, to conclude, I would like to highlight 3 essential factors had shaped the early Hadith criticism in the literature of both Hanafi and Mu'tazilite schools. First, Usul al-Qiyas and Usul al-Kalam as a substance, jawhar, of their long and complicated process manifested through the second factors, al-Adat, the non-isnad 5 tools. Both substance and tools had been driven by courts, public affairs, and requirements of justice as a motivation, al-Ba'ith, which made these schools aware of the Hadith content and its impact on public life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harido, for this fascinating presentation. I think that is very rich, and I hope I definitely have questions for you about this in the Q&A session. But for our next presentation, we're going to turn towards Junaid Qadri, who is going to talk to us about the valorization of Hadith among 19th and 20th century Hanafi thinkers. Please.
Thank you, Ahmed. I'm just going to try to share my screen here, and I'll ask for confirmation that people can see it. There we go. Is that visible? Great. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Ahmed, for the introduction, and thanks especially to Thomas Maguire, the Mesa Global Academy, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Chicago for organizing. And thank you also to those of you who've taken some time out in the middle of the day, or it may not be in the middle of the day where you are, but taking some time out of your day I also want to acknowledge and say that I look forward to the discussion with my co-panelists, all three of them, in fact. Okay. So my comments today do grow out of some of my previous work, but today's talk is very much a presentation of my recent exploration, and I would say my preliminary exploration of relatively new material, new questions I'm asking of some texts that I've worked with before, and an engagement with other texts for the first time. So I very much welcome comments and suggestions during the Q&A period. What I'm interested in pursuing today is the question of the increased salience of hadith in the thought of Hanafi scholars, starting in the late 19th century and well into the 20th century. Now, I should point out that my colleague and co-panelist Sohail Hanif has worked on the emergence of a hadith-focused Hanafism based in Egypt and Syria during the Ottoman period, and determining the precise relationship between that hadith centrism and that of the thinkers I take up requires further investigation in the future. But today, what I want to do is, again, in an exploratory fashion, lay out what I take to be the central features of the turn to hadith among Hanafis, or at least some key features of the turn to hadith among Hanafis in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I will look at three figures and try to trace the moves they make to advance their arguments reconciling Hanafism's approach to hadith. Okay. The first figure I want to look at is Shihab ad-Din al-Marjani, a quite important but I think underappreciated Hanafi scholar from Tatar Russia, who was born, as you see here, in 1818 and died in 1889. Marjani wrote prolifically and often with strong views related to events current in his time. Very famously, he wrote a history of the Bulgar Muslims, among other really important texts. But the text that I want to look at is titled Nadhurat al-Haq fi Fardiyat al-Isha wa illam yaghib al-Shafaq, a work in which Marjani is intent on establishing and justifying the obligation to perform the Isha prayer in locales where the evening twilight never entirely dissipates. The dissipation of evening twilight being, of course, the marker for the onset of the time for the nighttime prayer. The question of how precisely to observe this prayer at these extreme latitudes had been a recurring concern discussed, as one might expect, quite frequently by jurists before Marjani. And indeed, Marjani makes ample reference to his predecessors. But seemingly dissatisfied with the state of discourse, he decides to take up the question once again. Now, one way to understand the growing recourse to hadith in this period, that is my central focus in this presentation, is to view it as related to the growing demand for ijtihad among key Hanafi thinkers. This is certainly the case for Marjani, who displays a keen opposition to those of his time who he believed to be overly committed to taqlid. And though he makes reference to previous scholars like Ibn al-Humam, who pronounced on the obligation of the prayer, the nighttime prayer, in these locales, he frames his discussion nonetheless around the importance of reviving ijtihad. He speaks at length about the dangers of taqlid and insists on the continuing obligation of ijtihad, sometimes by reference to Hanafi authorities, but more importantly, through more foundational arguments about the necessity of strictly adhering to the Quran and the Sunnah, in opposition to those of his time who claim that this is the exclusive prerogative of the mujtahid. He gives as his reason for writing the book itself the need to clearly lay out important principles for, quote, the majority of the children of the present era, abna hadhihi al-a'sar, have forsaken our early imams, mutaqaddimin, and concealed their approach. They regard adhering to the adillah to be an innovation and opposing the masses and the riffraff to be misguidance and a deception. So the argument for a renewed focus on hadith obviously follows quite naturally from this emphasis on ijtihad. I want to suggest, however, a couple of other related considerations that will help us understand the contours of the context in which Marjani is intervening. The first is the presence of technological advancement that forces, I think, thinkers of this period to take stock and reimagine, in some cases, Islamic scholarship to have it speak in meaningful and viable ways to changing circumstances. This is evident only in rather elusive and incipient ways in Marjani, though it takes on a much clearer articulation in the work of Muhammad Bakhit al-Muti'i, who was heavily influenced by Marjani's views on ijtihad and hadith and tackled very directly the relationship of fiqh to a number of new technologies. In the case of Marjani, though, the title itself makes reference to the telescope, Nadhura. As you can see on the title page, although I don't know how visible it will render, but on the title page at the bottom here, let me see if I can point it out. On the bottom here, the title page of the earliest print of the work, there is a note at the bottom which explains what this technology is. Quote, an instrument of observation through which you can gaze at the celestial bodies and by aid of which you can acquaint yourself with hidden matters unavailable to plain sight due to their distance and size. The usage of this language in the title is not, I want to argue, a coincidence. Rather, the idea of accessing worlds until then unknown and plumbing their depths informs Marjani's argumentation throughout the text. There is a certain kind of intellectual confidence here that is symbolized and perhaps propelled by the new avenues for knowledge opened up by technological advances. We get a taste of this when Marjani takes up, almost as an aside, the traditional demand that Ramadan was to be declared according to a sighting of the new moon, and importantly, not by astronomical calculation. He upholds this position, but he draws the important distinction that this is only because there is an unequivocal mention in a clear hadith that demands it. This does not mean he is insistent on saying that this invalidates the truth of astronomical calculations and their correspondence to reality. This confidence in the capacity of the mind to know its objects is evident also in the demand for the reactivation of ijtihad and recourse to hadith. The second consideration I want to take up related to the emphasis on hadith in Marjani is the way he positions his intervention as a disruption of a post-classical consensus. Though he does not dismiss it outright, Marjani is wary of claims to ijma', relying among other citations on a narration from Ahmad bin Hanbal that he who claims an ijma' consensus has lied. In general, Marjani displays a suspicion and sometimes outright dismissal of the later scholars, the mutaakhirun, preferring the mutaqaddimun over them. He writes, as for the mutun of the later centuries, they are of an inferior quality to those mutun which should be relied upon, due to their authors' unreliability and their misappropriation of the opinions found in the shuruh, the fatawa, and other places. Related to this also is his attitude toward kalam. Famously dominant in the later centuries of medieval and early modern Islam, Marjani is clear that he places no stock in kalam. In the face of Taftazani, who in the Sharh al-Qaid al-Nasafiyya castigated those who claimed that the Salaf discredited kalam and prohibited it, Marjani does precisely that. He devotes an entire chapter to the falsification of ilm al-kalam, tazyif ilm al-kalam. Quoting from Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, Malik, Shafi'i, and Ahmad, he insists that what is extraneous to what is in the Quran and Sunnah are nothing but idle imaginings and corrupt conjectures. One of his criticisms of the education he was exposed to in Bukhara, for example, was its central emphasis on books of kalam, especially commentaries and glosses. As it turns out, this opposition to kalam opens up space for an approval of philosophy. Not unlike Muhammad Abdu, who studied philosophy with al-Afghani, Marjani speaks approvingly of philosophy, claiming that it does not contradict the Sharia, nor does the Sharia deny philosophy. Instead, the two are twins from the same mother of truth. In opposition to the prevailing tradition he inherited, I want to argue, is linked to his valorization of the Sunnah, which, along with the Quran, is the only safe site from which one may derive their beliefs. Now, I could say more about Marjani, but let me turn now to our second figure, Abdul Hayy Lakhnawi, who dies quite young, in fact, in 1886. Lakhnawi was born in Lucknow and died there, but also spent many years in Hyderabad. An ulama from the Farangi Mahal family, he really belonged to that South Asian world in which the preeminent figure was Shah Waliullah. So there are important precedents here to his hadith centrism. Lakhnawi wrote indefatigably, and one can detect throughout his oeuvre a valorization of hadith. I will focus here on his comments in the introduction to his commentary on Al-Jami' al-Saghir of Shaybani, titled Al-Nafi' al-Kabir. In this work, Lakhnawi is similarly critical of later scholarship. He singles out in particular some key fatwa texts, the Khulasa, the Fatawa Zahiriya, and the Fatawa of Qadi Khan, or the Fatawa Khaniya. Incidentally, Qadi Khan is also a recurrent target of critiques at the hands of Marjani. Lakhnawi holds that much of what can be found in these texts and others are mere extrapolations of their own, not the positions of the imams of the madhabs themselves. They are not proper narrations from the imam, sometimes due to being inappropriately transmitted. The imams, for their part, very seldom deviate from following the hadith. Take, for example, the case of raising the finger in the tashahhud position of the prayer. Many fatwa speak of it being prohibited or disliked to the extent that people began to consider this the madhab of Abu Hanifa. This in turn raises doubts about Abu Hanifa because there are many hadiths that indicate the permissibility of this action, indeed its being a sunnah. Lakhnawi goes on to quote Mullah Ali Qari to argue that there is in fact no disagreement among the Salaf on its permissibility. And then he says that this was the position of Abu Hanifa too. However, the people of Transoxania, Khurasan, Iraq, and India have discarded this position, having given in to the culture of taqlid and the relative inability to engage in tahqiq. I'll just say very quickly that Marjani incidentally also mentions these groupings, although he draws a distinction between the Transoxanians and the Iraqis, commenting, for example, on the lofty names given to the Central Asians that were used by the Central Asians as a kind of indication of them, of their sort of embellishment in making a show of their learning, in contrast, for example, to Jassas, Quduri, Tahawi, these very kind of family or other tribe or otherwise names, place names. And notably, one of the characteristics Marjani castigates this group, the Transoxanians, is for their belittling of hadith related from outside of the group. But back to Lakhnawi, who is occupied with salvaging the reputation of Abu Hanifa. If you understand the distinction, he says, between later scholars' positions and those of Abu Hanifa's, which are of a piece with the Salaf, you understand that those who criticize Abu Hanifa for his lack in hadith are mistaken. They are mistaking the extrapolations of later jurists, which were quite often in opposition to Sahih Hadith, as the verdict of Abu Hanifa. Lakhnawi, though, is more generous with later scholarship than Marjani is. He generously gives them an out, explaining the discrepancies by saying that these later jurists take the usul of the imams and draw conclusions from them, which often clash with Sahih Hadith. But this is only because they were unaware of those hadith and so could not know that they contradicted their opinion. So they are excused, even rewarded for their efforts. Ma'dhurun, ma'jurun. What is actually from the imams, on the other hand, is very rarely without a basis in the foundational texts. Indeed, Lakhnawi and Marjani both make a point to comment that there are plenty of narrations in which Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, Shaybani leave aside their own opinions when they encounter a contradicting Sahih Hadith. This rescuing of Abu Hanifa and his immediate students, Abu Yusuf and Shaybani, is a key feature of the turn to Hadith in this period. Hanafi writers like Lakhnawi are keen to find ways to ensure that Hanafism dodges the critique that the madhab places only secondary importance on hadith, or indeed ignores them altogether. Whereas it would have been previously perfectly appropriate to put forward a different theory of usul, some of which you've already heard from Dr. Isam, that stressed instead of hadith the practice and positions of early Hanafis or other non-isnad tools he mentions. Laknawi and others are more interested in making the case that there is no contradiction in the first place, that the claimed clash is a fictitious one that has no real basis. Indeed, it is an unfortunate twist in the history of the Hanafi school, where later jurists mistakenly attribute their own extrapolations and deductions to the masters. This observation, I'm going to say very quickly this part, this observation motivates Laknawi to offer a revamped understanding of the hierarchy of the masail of the school, roughly the positions of the school as contained in certain texts. So there was a prevailing hierarchy, evident, for example, in Ibn Abidin's Radd al-Muhtar, which placed the Masail in 3 levels: the Usul, taken from select books of al-Shaybani; the Nawadir, which includes positions taken from other less reliable texts of Muhammad bin Hassan, as well as from others; and the third, the Fatawa or Waqiyat, which are deductions of later jurists. Laknawi offers a different 5-fold categorization: those Masail that accord with the Quran and Hadith without any countervailing proof texts; those masail that are compliant with the principles of the Sharia and have support from the Quran and Sunnah, even though there exist opposing, though weaker, hadith in transmission. Both of these categories, one must accept the proof text, the stronger proof text. Those masail that are compliant, the third category, that are compliant with the principles of the Sharia, but are opposed by strong and authentic hadith. How to deal with these should be left to experts, people of knowledge and wisdom, to make a judgment on which of the 2 opposed positions should be adopted. And then fourth, those masail which are only the result of analogical deduction, qiyas, and are opposed by, in quote, unextinguishable proof text. In this case, again, one must follow the stronger proof text. Laknawi says that this is proper taqleed, even though it appears in the form of abandoning taqleed. And then finally, those opinions which have no Shari'i basis whatsoever, they are simply the inventions of the mutaakhirun who blindly follow their fathers and sheikhs. These, of course, should be discarded and indeed should be attacked. Take heed of this categorization, he concludes. Very few are acquainted with it, but by overlooking it, many are led astray from the straight path. Okay, I want to move on to my next figure here. I want to stay on this theme of salvaging Abu Hanifa on the question of hadith, but turn to my final writer, Muhammad Zahid al-Kawthari, the deputy to the last Ottoman Shaykh al-Islam, and a towering figure of 20th century Hanafism. Kawthari was something of a polemicist, and so fittingly the book that I want to look at is his refutation of al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, titled Ta'nib al-Khatib ala ma saqahu fi tarjamat Abi Hanifa min al-Akadhib, or censuring al-Khatib for the lies he propounds with respect to the biography of Abu Hanifa. The defense of Abu Hanifa recurs in many places throughout the text, but I want to focus on one passage that reveals both his motivation to defend the eponym on the question of hadith, but also his particular mode of doing so. In response to al-Khatib's quotations of earlier authorities that claimed that Abu Hanifa was an, quote, orphan, yatim, when it came to hadith, or that he was afflicted, zamin, when it came to hadith, Kawthari is adamant that those who claim Abu Hanifa possessed very few hadith, or regularly held positions in opposition to hadith, or that he trafficked in weak hadith, such people are entirely ignorant. It is true, Kawthari admits, that if one understands qillat al-hadith to mean a lack of interest in numerous and proliferating chains of narration, as is the practice, occupying oneself with those elements, is the practice of those who devote themselves exclusively to hadith. We acknowledge, he says, that Abu Hanifa's approach was not of that sort. Neither was he interested in amassing hundreds of thousands of hadith. Instead, he worked with a selective group of hadith and was acquainted with others outside that set by virtue of his association with many of his companions. The group, that what Kawthari calls a majma' fiqhi, an assembly of jurists of which Abu Hanifa was the head. Kawthari thereby distances Abu Hanifa from the Ahl al-Hadith, even as he wants to save him from the criticism that he was unacquainted or weak in hadith. This is accomplished by stressing Abu Hanifa's legalism, or his praxis-based legalism. Abu Hanifa was not merely about amassing hadith. This is a criticism that his critics use, but they misunderstand his role. Instead, Abu Hanifa was a mujtahid who weighed evidence and subjected even sahih hadith to strict constraints before declaring them worthy of being acted upon. And again, you've got a sense of this already from the first presentation. But here's the list or a selection from the list that that Kawthari gives, a list of the usul that Abu Hanifa relied upon to deduce rulings. Again, the term usul is used here. The acceptance of mursal hadith, which is of course a well-known topic in usul al-fiqh. Secondly, subjecting ahad hadith to principles at which Abu Hanifa, the eponym or the mujtahid, has arrived through an inductive survey of the sources of Sharia, and rejecting reports that conflict with those principles, rejecting ahad hadith that conflict with the umumat and zawahir, roughly the plain meanings of the Quran, rejecting ahadith that conflict with the sunnah mashhura, so important Hanafi category, whether that sunnah is articulated or merely practiced, whether it's fi'liya or qawliya. The stipulation, number 5, the stipulation that the narrator not act in a fashion contrary to the purport of the hadith. Number 6, refusing to act on ahad hadith in matters of umum al-balwa, widely known matters that afflict or affect all people in society. And he says this is because the umum al-balwa is established through either tawatur or shuhra. And finally, insistence that the khabar not conflict with an inherited practice, amal mutawarith, from the Sahaba and the Tabi'un. This is a partial list taken from the longer one that Kawthari gives, but it is enough to demonstrate, as he says, that when Abu Hanifa rejected acting on a hadith, he did so not out of obstinance, inadan, but out of his legal judgment, ijtihadan. With Kawthari, then, we have a very interesting case of a modern thinker who, like his colleagues, defends Abu Hanifa and Hanafism from hadith, but does so by stressing his role as a jurist and emphasizing praxis, not just the amassing of hadiths and chains of narration. Unlike Laknawi, who seeks to rescue Abu Hanifa from the charge of being anti-hadith by drawing a line between the eponym and later Hanafis, Kawthari both argues that Abu Hanifa was knowledgeable about hadith in his own way and handled them in a manner appropriate to his role as a jurist, a participant in a more holistic enterprise that required sifting through evidences in order to arrive at an appropriate basis for action. Whereas in Laknawi, the usul of the Imam are subordinated to the hadiths themselves, the relationship is reversed in Kawthari, for whom the usul are, in fact, governing principles. So there's much more to say about Hanafi attitudes and engagements with the hadith in this period, including texts and figures that I haven't looked at in today's presentation. I have in mind particularly here the vibrant hadith commentary tradition that takes off in South Asia in the 20th century, especially associated with luminaries of the Deoband school. But I hope that what I have presented provides a glimpse into some of the many facets of Hanafi thought, grappling with the challenge of hadith in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Junaid, for this presentation. So the last presentation today is going to be by Suhail Hanif, who's visiting us virtually from the UK. He is teaching at the Cambridge Muslim College after completing his PhD at Oxford, and his talk is on the topic of Fiqh as theology, situating the relationship between Qiyas and Hadith and early classical Hanafi thought. Please take it away.
Thank you very, very much. Getting my slides up. I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to speak on this wonderful panel. Very honored to be speaking at the University of Chicago, although it's virtually. And very grateful for the center for the invitation. My talk sits somewhere in between the last two presentations. Junaid spoke about the tradition which was trying to sort of bring Hanafism together with a general conception of the Hadith tradition, salvage or defend Abu Hanifa, if you like. Dr. Isam spoke about the very early development of legal theory pertaining to the topic of hadiths. I'm coming right in the middle of the two. And so the period I work on primarily, I call it early classical, which for me primarily, I consider it the 5th to the 7th Islamic centuries. the reason why I'm quite fascinated by this period is that it's the period right where Dr. Isam ends, which is the period when you really have a mature sense of a classical school, you know, a sense of what is the genre of commentary, which all commentators are now following, a sense of what are the main classics of legal theory, which will really inform the entire tradition thereafter. So I use sometimes the word mature, and maybe a better word should be sought out, but it's the idea of settled genres, settled theory. The other reason why I like this period a lot is it's a period of great antagonism between the schools. So there's no attempt to somehow make Abu Hanifa appealing to Shafi'is or appealing to anybody else. This is a period of antagonism. In other words, a fully self-aware Hanafism, which is other than the other forms of legal traditions. What I seek to present concerning this period today is not necessarily new research. All the theories of Qiyas and Hadith are things I've written on elsewhere. But what is new for me, which I've not done previously in a setting such as this, is to repackage the entire theory. What I want to do is, after presenting a summary of the theory, and I apologize for not going into too much detail to defend my summary, but I just want to give enough of a summary so you understand how Qiyas and Hadith do relate in early classical Hanafi legal theory and commentary. After presenting it, I just want to step back and with just another sort of lens or idiom, try and think, well, what is this discipline doing then? What are its commitments? And I'd like to say fiqh is more a process which is theological than legal. We might say that in general because fiqh is a sacred law, but the fiqh of Abu Hanifa is a very peculiar form of theological activity. This is my claim. The funny diagram on the right for me is the summary of my talk. So if you get the diagram, then that's it. You've kind of made it. So what I in my repackaging, you know, these Arabic terms are more like Sufism sort of terms. They're not terms from Hanafi legal theory at all, but it's the idiom that I feel, once you zoom out, it's the idiom that I feel is what's happening in this theory and in this commentary tradition. Tafakkur, takhalluq, that's a really weird one. That's full on Sufism, becoming like God. But what is fully and purely from the legal theory is this trait of God called hikmah, which seems to be underpinning the entire relationship then between Qiyas and Hadith. And to come back, why am I bringing Qiyas into this as the fundamental theory, although our topic today is about Hadith? It's just because, just like Dr. Isam presented, the Hadith theory cannot be separated from Hanafi thought. There's no Hanafi Hadith approach to Hadith criticism that just stands by itself. It's part of an approach to knowledge of the law, but I'll be saying today, knowledge of God actually. And Qiyas is what that theory of Hadith is embedded within. And so there's no separating Hadith from Qiyas. That's why one has to look at them together to situate the Hadith theory. So today I want to look at bits and bobs, if you like, from Usul al-Fiqh, Furu' al-Fiqh, and then what I'm calling now the path of wisdom. And that's my repackaging. And again, you might wonder where this might go, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts on this, really. Within the Usul al-Fiqh, again, just as simple as I can, what is the distinction between, in basic terms, Hanafi Qiyas theory and the non-Hanafi, or the other, which we can just call Shafi'i for now. Shafi'i is the other in much of this period's legal literature. So what is the difference in basic terms between the two Qiyas theories? How Qiyas and Hadith weigh up in an economy of certainty in the legal theory? The Furu' al-Fiqh, very quickly, depending on how much time we have, just one or two examples how the commentary literature really is building on the theory that's in the Usul al-Fiqh. And finally, what I'm terming today, the path of wisdom, in which we'll think about, well, what is fiqh in law and how fiqh is really a theological exercise, a very peculiar form of, a particular form of theological exercise. So first of all, readings in Hanafi legal theory. Hanafi Qiyas theory. So Aaron Zaisau, who I consider the great Imam, really, I benefited a great deal from his very insightful reflections on the theory of Qiyas. He calls the Hanafi approach to Qiyas, he calls it methodological monism, meaning It's a very peculiar and restricted theory. What Sarakhsi, who's one of the main legal theorists, or just to mention, sorry, to go back, the reflections I'm giving today are primarily from the Usul of Sarakhsi and Bazdawi, both from the end of the 5th Islamic century, but they really did set the mold for what I would call high classical legal theory, all the way through the Hanafi tradition. So Sarakhsi says very clearly, 3/4 of what people are calling Qiyas is not Qiyas. There's a conscious idea that there's a lot of things called Qiyas. We really want just one of those things. That's called Hanafi Qiyas. Zaisa has this fascinating insight I'd love to develop further elsewhere, where he says Hanafi rationality is horizontal and the Shafi'i rationality is vertical. I'm not going to go into the vertical so much today, but the horizontal is quite meaningful for me. When the Hanafi theorists want to talk about their Qiyas versus the Qiyas of the other, they contrast these two ideas, that we, the Hanafis, look for effectiveness. And that requires what Zaisa might call a sort of horizontal reasoning within the law. And I'll try to summarize what that is. As for the other, the thoughtless other, they just care about coexistence of legal causes. So what do we mean by coexistence? What is the other all about? The other will, this is a very basic Qiyas theory, as any sort of Qiyas as you'll find in your secondary sources, really, general Qiyas theory. What is it? You have a primary case, which is active. Green is like active. There's an active ruling in it. For example, wine is forbidden to drink. That's literally the only example you will find in most of these legal theory books. And then you have secondary case of some drink, I don't know, something like beer, and you don't know what is the ruling of beer. So how do you transfer one to the other? So in the standard theory, you have to kind of dissect your primary case into its core features. Feature 1 might be its color. Feature 2 might be its flavor. Feature 3 might be the fact that wine intoxicates. Feature 4, some other feature. And then you go through each of them and see which of these has an actual bearing on that legal ruling. If you negate the color, no, the primary case is still there. Redness has no meaning in the forbiddenness of drinking something. What if we negate the flavor? No, there's nothing in taste that leads to drinks to be forbidden. What if you negate intoxication? And they'll say, oh, we found a clink. There's a particular feature. If it's absent, the ruling is absent. If it's present, the ruling is present. That's what they mean by coexistence. And that feature is what you call the cause. So then we find this link. We have now identified the illa, the cause, the thing which, if it's absent, the ruling is absent. If it's present, the ruling is present, namely intoxication. Now we can analyze the whole host of drinks you find in the world. All you're looking for is the triangle, because you found it now, intoxication. Whichever drink has it, then the ruling is active. You cannot drink that drink. This classic textbook sort of approach to Qiyas, that's what the Hanafis reject. This is a meaningless approach. There's no reflection in it. This is not Qiyas. This is not a meaningful approach. What they're looking for is what they call effectiveness. In effectiveness, it's not even necessary to have this idea of a primary case and a secondary case. What you're looking for very simply is the case in hand, whatever the case might be. In order to answer the question, is this case, allowed, not allowed? Can you do it? Is this contract valid, invalid? How do you answer any new case? What they say you have to do, this is why Zaisa calls it horizontal, you have to reflect on the entire nexus of established legal rules. Any legal rule that might have a bearing on your case, you have to look at the entire family of cases. And as you look at the family of possible cases, some are in clusters, some are in way off angles, which might not seem immediately relevant, but they're all in the world of legal cases. You then have to reflect upon those cases. How do they work? What are their meanings? What are the underpinning concepts or maxims or reasons for how they work? And then you group them. So every color is a sort of idea. One of the principles of law or a maxim of law or a reason how those cases work. And then you have to reflect which of those is the most suitable idea or underpinning reason that is most present in the case at hand. If you find the case at hand most resembles the gray cases, then you've made your analogy. Because what you've done is you found a cause that is effective. What does it mean to be effective? We know for sure God considers this cause to be active because we found it elsewhere in his law. So what is analogy? It is about reasoning with all of the law, making sense of God's law. So then you can answer a new question. That's the very simple summary of their elaborate theory. And again, I apologize, we don't have time to go into the details of that theory. Two examples that they give within these Usul works, a debate with Shafi'i. When you wipe your head in ritual ablutions, is it sunnah, meaning highly recommended, to do this 3 times, as Shafi'i says, or to do it once, as the Hanafi says? What's Shafi'i's analogy, as represented in these Hanafi texts, of course? They don't really care about Shafi'i, what Shafi'i says, but it's about ways to think about what is a most reasonable answer. So the way they present Shafi'i's analogy, they say, oh, he's just looking at what you might call integrality, meaning wiping the head is an integral, meaning it's an obligatory part of ritual ablution, just like washing the faces. Washing the face is done 3 times. It's recommended to do that. So wiping the head should be done 3 times. That's integrality. And the Hanafis say, yes, but that meaning is not effective. You don't find anywhere in the sacred law that every time something is an obligatory element, you do it 3 times. You haven't reflected, O Shafi'i. You haven't considered the sense of what you're saying. So all they talk about is what you might simply call wipingness, which doesn't seem so attractive. But then it goes a broader and broader set of rational reflections. They say, well, look at all the cases of wiping within the law. You look at tayammum, you look at wiping over the khuf, you look at wiping over the head, maybe wiping the ears. Wiping is a thing that happens elsewhere in the law. And Shafi'i agrees with us that wiping is an easier, more relaxed form of purification. That's why no one says you must wipe the entire head or wipe the entire khuf. So the idea is wiping just in the sense of wiping versus washing. Washing is intense, wiping is light. Washing, you wash all, wiping, you wipe less. So there's something in the meaning of wiping in the law that's somehow light. That's one part of it. Then they say, oh, Shafi'i, give us a rule what sunnahs are. And then they come up with quite a fascinating theory of all the sunnahs of ritual worship. Prayer, wudu, ghusl, what is the meaning of a sunnah in ritual? Extreme form of distant horizontal reasoning now to answer one question within ritual ablution. And they say, well, sunnahs, all of them just complement and complete obligatory elements. And they talk, and so they'll say, so when you bow, bowing is a posture. What is a sunnah? To complete that bowing, to prolong it, to make it a sense of what bowing is, which is glorifying God. And so then they say, well, we all agree you wipe a part of it. So what's the sunnah? To complete all of it. That's how it fits within all the rest of sunnahs in ritual worship. But then they say, okay, then why is the face washed 3 times? And they say, well, because when you wash it once, you've already encompassed the limb. So how do you complete it? Do it again. Otherwise, the basic sunnah is just to encompass. I'm sorry, I don't mean to convince you of anything. I don't really mind how you wipe your heads. I'm not here to sell anything to you. And maybe my argument wasn't convincing, but all I want to get across is this form of reasoning is one about extreme horizontal reasoning. The entire law is sensible. The entire law is filled with meaningful patterns. Qiyas means to enter into the sense of the law. Otherwise, you have no right to talk. As for this present and absent illa business, that's not fiqh for this group of jurists. Another common example in the Usul text to illustrate these 2 forms of reasoning is they both scholars agree a father may marry off a minor daughter, and then they disagree. What about the mature daughter? Can he marry her off? Shafi'i, i.e. without her permission, Shafi'i says he may, because virginity is the main reason here. If she's a virgin, he can marry her off. If she's not a virgin, then he can't. And the Hanafi answer is, again, similarly, where in the law has virginity got anything to do with guardianship? That's a meaningless statement. What always is tied with guardianship? Guardianship is about representing someone who's incapable. And what is the mark of incapacity? It's being young. So what's virginity got to do with it? It's about minority. When a girl is a minor, the dad represents her in her contract. When she's a mature lady, he cannot. Again, not to sell anything. Apologies if I'm going quickly, but that's just to, again, represent that diagram. A very different view of the meaning of qiyas. Once we've got that sense of what qiyas means, it's sort of lateral thinking within the sense of the law. What's important then is what, again, the phrase is from Zaisal. Usul al-Fiqh is about grading things you're more sure about above things you're less sure about. So you can build an approach to the law. In this early classical legal theory, this is the essential summary of their economy of certainty. What does that mean? We are very, very sure about clear Quranic expressions. We are almost equally sure about hadiths if they're accepted by jurists from the Salaf. It's what they call the Mashhur report. It's a bit of a spectrum here, meaning some of those they will treat really on a par to interpret the Quran, and some are a bit weaker than that. Scholarly consensus similarly. Some are right up there, some forms of consensus as strong as the Holy Quran, and some are a bit weaker. A thing of some debate amongst them, any Salaf jurist, anybody, has a position and we don't know any disagreement. A bit of a debate, but generally that they consider that very, very strong. But here's the important thing I want to stress. After these basic ideas of Quran, Salaf really, and Ijma', Qiyas is the most sure thing in Hanafi legal theory. Qiyas is the arbiter of any other indicator of the law. It's after Qiyas we approach the majority of the hadith corpus. The examples in the classical theory, they'll talk about a hadith narrated by a non-jurist companion. The example they like to give in these usul texts, certainly Sarakhsi and Bazdawi, is Abu Huraira or Anas ibn Malik. Well-known companions, but they weren't outstandingly known for fiqh. So any hadith they narrate has to be viewed through a filter of qiyas, i.e., this mind that's been trained in the sense of the law, does this hadith make sense to such a mind? Does that mind find a fit within the law? If yes, the hadith is good. If not, we'll stick to what we're more sure about, which is our sense of the law. And also they'll say any hadith not known to have been accepted or rejected by Salaf jurists. If it's known to be accepted, then it's up here. If it's known to be rejected, then the hadith is wrong. It's like a lie, basically. But the rest of the hadith corpus, which is the majority of hadiths, I would say, you view them through the filter of qiyas. The mind that's been trained, if it finds a fit in the law, it can accept those hadiths. If not, we are more sure about qiyas than we are sure about much of the hadith corpus. So you get this idea then, like I'm saying, we are more sure that the trained mind can discern the sense of God's law. That's the theological premise in Hanafi law. Then we are sure of the accuracy of much of the hadith corpus, because there's errors in both. There's an error in the mind. The mind might have got the sense of the law wrong. And there's errors in hadith transmission. This man might have forgotten, this man might have twisted it, that man might have lied. But it's a probability judgment. And what's fascinating in this high classical Hanafi theory, the probability for error for them is much less in the mind's ability to grasp the sense of God's law than it is in this error-prone for them hadith transmission system, where it's not supported by a Salaf acceptance with early jurists. What is the trained mind? And so here, all I'll say is, I've got one very heavy text example. But the point is, if I give you no examples at all, you can just take it from me perhaps. But the commentary works of this entire period, and I'll say this reflects what came before the period and influenced what came after the period. But just to keep my periodization tight for now, the entire commentary production of this period, you will find it follows a particular pattern. It always will have a legal rule which it comments on, and this is particularly is what I would sometimes call ancient law, Abu Hanifa and those before. It's not typically current to the age of the commentators. And what I'm calling essential activity for commentators, it is actually arguing to uphold the rule. And so what I argue is that these texts primarily are training the mind in learning from those legal rules how the law is working. Only secondarily and occasionally do commentators talk about which position is stronger, which position should be followed as law, how to apply law to a social context, further legal cases of interest. These are fascinating features, but they're occasional. The essential purpose of commentary is to train the reader in getting the sense of the law. That's why they're what I would call their almost primary purpose, really, if you were to see how they argue, is training in rational argumentation, what I can now call simply Qiyas in today's presentation, how the law fits together as a whole. Some of their arguments are how they present what would later be called maxims, some of just what you might at a very high level call wisdom, some at a lower level are rational rules. But this is the point of commentary. Here's my, it's terrible, sorry, it's so full of text here. What this is about, if you want to read it or not, it's a very strange topic. A mouse dies in a well, and Abu Hanifa says you have to make up the last day's prayers if the mouse's body is whole, or make up 3 days of prayers if the mouse's body has disintegrated. And his two students say, no, don't worry about it. You saw the mouse today, don't make up any prayers, but just get rid of the mouse, please, because it makes the well water filthy. All I want to show in this example is we don't really care so much about the mouse. What this is an opportunity for is a great deal of simply lateral legal reasoning. He'll introduce you in the argument to maxims, well-known maxims, and then a response to that well-known maxim. How do you implement maxims in the law? The response simply says, oh, if there's a well-known cause, you have to treat it as certain. You can't do this thing that I'm not 100% sure, therefore it never happened. And then you talk about related cases, and then responses to related cases, rules about time. That's all I'll say for now, and I apologize if you're trying to read the text, if you really care about the mouse in the well as well. But all I wish to say right now is, this is the architecture of legal commentary. The rule is there as an occasion to tie together the entirety of the law in bits and pieces as you go through. It's a training in what I'm calling legal reasoning. And that leads to my repackaging. All of that was my introduction. So what's the repackaging in just 5 minutes? This is my repackaging. If you want to zoom out, what must you conclude from these theological premises and the fundamental activity of these commentators? Oh, going back to legal theory, first of all, what is fiqh? This is not repackaging. Abu Yusr al-Bazdawi has a fascinating definition of fiqh, which really gets to the heart of what I'm trying to say. He says, fiqh is the knowledge of that which underpins. That's the most idiotic way. That's called Freudian. I didn't mean to say idiotic. I meant to say idiomatic. That was the idiomatic way I could find to do the opposing idiom, which is ulliqa, which actually means to hang. What he's saying in brief, he's saying, what is fiqh? If you take legal rulings, which have come from the book, or from the sunnah, or from the ijma'. Fiqh is not to know the rulings. Fiqh is not to know the book. Fiqh is not to know the book led to the rulings. Fiqh is about something else. Fiqh is about knowing that thing through which the rulings are suspended. Fiqh is to know what I'm simply saying today, the sense of the rulings. You might say the why of the rulings. You might say the meaning of the rulings. And this is a long passage. It's not me interpreting into his words. It's a long passage where he really wants to say fiqh is not about the rulings and it's not about the book. Fiqh is about knowing how these rulings are functioning. And he says one thing in his passage which is important to me because it includes the word wisdom. He says this conception, fiqh is not about the rulings and it's not about the book. It's about what holds up the rulings. He said this is what's indicated by the book of God. He gives wisdom to whomever he wills. The people of exegesis have said wisdom is fiqh. What is wisdom? It's the knowledge of the realities of things. Whoever discovers their true meanings is called a faqih. Whoever memorizes legal cases and exegesis, legal cases meaning rules, exegesis meaning, oh, it came from the book because of this verse and this word means this thing. That's not fiqh. If you don't discover the real meaning, the hidden meaning, the real significance, you're only figuratively part of this discipline. So if you go into legal theory again, just two more quotes. Wisdom appears to me to be the fundamental activity of how man relates to God in this system. From the Manar, divine injunctions are necessarily characterized by goodness, since the one commanding is wise. We are in some way in this activity of fiqh, in Abu Hanifa's school, we are trying to connect to God through his attribute of wisdom. That is the underlying concept that underpins everything that I can see in this system. Here's from Debussy. It is not valid according to hikmah that we should be obliged to undertake an act for God, except that it truly is good according to God. God is all wise. His acts are free of purposelessness. So he does not order such purposelessness of us. So we must, almost like a moral injunction, we must discern the trait of goodness in what he orders us to do. Almost like a moral injunction from us. Why is this good? What is the sense of it? Where's the wisdom in what God is asking us to do? And so it appears to me that this Hanafi mature system of thought, it's a system which in one sense is exonerating God of the charge of foolishness. God is wise, the law makes sense. Anything else is to attribute foolishness to God. So it's a theological activity to, in one sense, magnify God. That's why I use the phrase tafakkur in the opening slide. What is tafakkur? It's knowing, oh, how perfect is God? How powerful is God? How amazing is God? Look at how the trees work and the flowers work and the water cycle work. So similarly, we do that with God's law. Look how perfect the law is. Look how amazing God is. Oh, he's protecting our children. Oh, he's looking after our souls, and so on. This seems to be the essential activity. And it trains the mind to reflect the mind of God. And that's what's the most amazing thing underpinning the premise. That the school of Abu Hanifa is premised on the fact that the mind of man can reflect the mind of God. And if you go through this training, your mind is somehow mirroring God's mind, i.e., what we know of God's mind through his law, which is how God has revealed his mind to us. And that's why ultimately it is theology. We are learning about God. Fiqh is approaching God through his attribute of wisdom as manifest in his law. And that's the fundamental, or I think is the unique premise of Hanafi thought. The human mind is capable. That's why we are more sure of what the mind can figure out from the sense of God's law than this whole hadith corpus, if it's not supported by Salaf practice and acceptance. What is the law? This also puzzled me. Sorry, just one more minute, inshallah, and then I'm done. What is law? You find that declaring law is not a primary activity of commentators. Primarily, they're explaining the sense of this transmitted law from Abu Hanifa, and they give occasional statements. This is preferred, this is better, this should be followed. But it doesn't seem their primary activity. And it appears to me that what they're doing in this training is, law is what will be produced by the deliberations of the wise. Who are the wise? The people who've gone through this training. You've understood the sense of God's law. You've understood how law changes for society. You've understood a whole host of ways to thinking about what God wants. So make law now. This is my understanding so far. Where do hadiths fit then? It appears then that what is this particular approach to hadith? It's that you filter the hadith corpus through wisdom. That's what they mean by filtering it through qiyas. When I summarize this sometimes, I sometimes call that this Hanafi approach from the legal theory. I call it Salaf-based, fiqh-based, hadith-friendly. I have to call hadith friendly because it looks unfriendly till you think about it. It's Salaf-based because the Salaf and the jurists of the Salaf are the fundamental way to understand what is a strong report. It's fiqh-based because after the Salaf, it's your own understanding, which is the main filter of which hadith should be accepted, which should not be accepted. Why is it hadith friendly? Because I believe this approach allows a larger number of hadiths to be practiced than the traditionist system. Because the traditionist system, as soon as there's a break in the chain, it's rejected. As soon as there's irsal, it's rejected. As soon as the man lied once, it's rejected. If you think about it, they filter out a huge amount of hadiths in their very precautious approach. This particular theory doesn't care so much about chains and connectedness or whether he even lied once. After you get the Salaf and you've done this wisdom training, it's simply about, yeah, the Prophet might have said it, let's practice it. Yeah, that's really meaningful, let's practice it. And so I consider it Salaf-based, fiqh-based, hadith-friendly. And the reason why I consider this almost like a personal path as well as a legal path, this is my last slide, is that the individual will learn the sense of the law, and then he'll have an internalized, or she of course, an internalized measure of wisdom. And then it appears to me, what is the pious life? It's to devote yourself thereafter, after fiqh, to a study of hadiths, anything the Prophet might have said. If it's good, practice it. If it's good, practice it. So let wisdom guide you and let piety drive you, meaning let wisdom be your sense, and then let piety drive you into these sources, which is why I'm currently interested in studying the pietistic tradition of early classical Hanafis, because I feel there has to be an expression of where this theory is going in the life of the individual outside of simply law. So that's my, apologize if I've went a bit over time. That's the meaning of the diagram. And I never have props for presentations, but I've almost got a prop here today, which is a mug a student gave me once, but I think it summarizes everything. It says, that's hadith over there. That's, I think, what does it say? Fiqh without madhab. And this, my dear friends, is what it's all about. So that's all I have to say there. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you very much for these three, I think, really interesting talks, and you know, putting more than one talk together on one panel, putting panels together is a little bit like cooking, because things come out of things, even if you haven't planned it in advance. Common themes emerge, and new ideas that kind of pass through the various talks. So if I may start with answering an overall question, is, I mean, first of all, to Isam and Suhail, both of you mentioned the theology to a significant extent in different ways, but what about the what about the Kalam position of Hanafis? What about Murji'ite and Mu'tazilite theological influence on these early Hanafi thinkers? Do you think we can explain them primarily as Hanafis and their view, basically as Suhail put it, as an overarching view of how the law works, how relationship between humans and God work, etc., or can we see ideas from Kalam debates influencing these legal theorizations of the law, and how Hadith works within the law? So that's my question to Isam and Suhail, and for Junaid, you've shown some really interesting, some well-known, some lesser-known 19th and 20th century Hanafis. But to what extent do you think that that their interest in Hadith comes from a common source? Does it kind of is there a genealogical common source, like a simplistic way of whatever, is it Ibrahim al-Qurani or whatever, whatever you or is it is it a specific usefulness of the hadith? Is it specific usefulness of the hadith to criticize that the established Hanafi tradition, or how do you make sense of that? So these would be my questions. If you do, would you like to answer them now, or shall we gather some more questions? What?
We can gather some now.
Oh, okay. So shall we start with Rami Puja and then Asad al-Zaman?
Hi, can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Thank you all for the presentation. My question is for Dr. Hanif. You've outlined this theory of Hanafism and this sort of theological impetus that is organizing the legal thought. And I'm wondering whether there's a particular issue that comes up in the Usul debates, and that seems to challenge a little bit, I think, your presentation. And I'm wondering, what your take on it would be. Essentially, the debate is on whether the basis of a hukm is the illah or the nas. And just for those not familiar with it, it's just the idea of, for example, when the Quran prohibits wine, is the grounds of the prohibition the text itself, or is it the illah like underlying that text, which is the feature of intoxication? The majority of the Hanafis say that it's the nas that is the basis of the prohibition, whereas the Shafi'is say that it's the illah. And so in that way, you see these sort of two competing versions of what the consistency is supposed to be in, right? Because for the Shafi'is, on that basis, beer is not prohibited on the basis of Qiyas, it's prohibited on the basis of the illah. The debate is basically essentially, when God legislates, does he legislate specific rules, or does he legislate principles? And the Shafi'is in this argument are saying that he's legislating principles. So I wonder if you find that to be a snag in your understanding of what the Hanafi view is, I mean, based on your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, next question by Asad Zaman.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you to the panelists for their papers. I guess my question is more targeted towards Dr. Issam and Dr. Hanif. So I think Dr. Issam had mentioned, the non-isnad methods for hadith criticism, and Dr. Hanif's indirectly, at least, provided some kind of methodology. But usually these questions revolve around I guess for lack of a better word, authenticity as related to legal practice, contents of a hadith to be practiced upon legally. My main concern is history and seerah and the Prophet's biography. Are there any examples of Hanafis using their hadith critical methodology to criticize historical traditions and traditions of the seerah? I know Abu Yusuf did work on seerah, but if you could mention any well-known Hanafis who worked in seerah. Thank you.
Now let's take as the last question. Let's take this question from the chat by Muntasir Zaman. I don't know, Asad Zaman, Muntasir Zaman, are they related? I don't know. So how did Hanafi jurists during the formative?
Ahmed Al-Shamsi, do you hear me?
Okay, would you like to ask a question?
Sayyid Ahmed Al-Shamsi.
Yes. Would you like to ask?
Can you hear me? I have a short question.
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Ahmed al-Shamsi.
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, so shortly, my question for presenter, he mentioned that but he used as-Sunnah Majma alayh. Is there any differences between Imam Malik as-Sunnah Majma alayh or Balhi Sunnah Majma alayh? If it's same, no problem. If it's not, what are the main differences? Thank you so much.
All right, I think that was a question to Isam, and so let me just end with the last question before we go into answering them by Muntasir al-Zaman. How did Hanafi jurists during the formative and early post-formative periods interact with non-legal hadith, such as stories of the prophets, ethics in the final hour? I think that is actually very similar to kind of Asad Zaman's question, so maybe we can answer that together as well. So shall we start in the order with Isam, and then go to Junaid and then Suhail?
Yes, so the first question coming from Dr. Ahmed. So this is a very important question. I don't know if I can see this question in the same way as see Muntasir Zaman and Asad Zaman, is like the wide aspect of hadith. So like talking about kalam, talking about sirah, talking about tarikh, and how this is what I got from you, Dr. Ahmed, is like, do you mean like the perspective of Hanafi scholars on kalam in their books, in their fiqh? Is this like what you meant, or?
Well, the question is like, are they when they talk about the meaning of hadith, when you compare them to, let's say, Mu'tazili thinkers, is it? I mean, like, are we talking about the same thing? Like, am I a Hanafi or am I a Mu'tazili? Which, of course, you know, there are people who are Mu'tazili Hanafis, there are Shafi'i Mu'tazilis, whatever. So, is this, you know, can we say that there is a Hanafi position? Or to what extent are they in conversation with kalam debates at the time, and to what extent are we, you know, does it make sense to talk about the ahnaf as separate in their way in which they read hadith from kalam fashions of the day? And I mean, to me, I mean, there's this one issue about early Hanafism, is that so many of the early Hanafi books don't exist anymore. Usul al-Fiqh books, the beginning of al-Jassas's work is missing, you know, which has led a lot of people to speculate about, you know, what it actually said, whether it actually shows that they were kind of more engaged with, let's say, Mu'tazili kalam or other issues. So I mean, I'm not saying that you need to have answers for this, but do you have? I mean, what is your take on this?
Yeah, that's clear. So I just want to mention maybe a story incident mentioned by Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar in his book Fadl al-I'tizal. Someone came to Abu Hanifa and said, Zufar, your student is Qadari. That means Qadari in that time means Mu'tazili. And Abu Hanifa said, Da'hu فَإِنَّ الْفِقْهَ يَرُدُّهُ. So just leave him, and then fiqh will change him, or will maybe discipline him. So it seems like if this like story is right, it seems like for Abu Hanifa and others, there are two relims, fiqh and kalam. So if you work in fiqh, and then you need to have a different perspective on hadith, different from kalam. However, especially in Kitab al-Fawaid al-Bahiyya is a very important collection on Hanafi figures. Al-Laknawi very interested in mentioning the theological inclinations, or maybe Sufi inclinations of these figures. And I traced all of these figures, like who are Mu'tazilite in early Hanafi period, and very, very few in late, like early classical period. But yes, we can witness a lot of Hanafi figures who are Mu'tazilite. So do we witness any literature written by them to see how they approach hadith? Like we can see al-Jassas, like the works by al-Jassas, al-Tahawi, and all of these figures. No inclinations to maybe Mu'tazilite or Murji'ah or others. Bishr al-Marisi yes, one of these figures who are surrounded of like Hanafi and Hanafi figures, and he has a very obvious inclination towards other schools. So I think discovering manuscripts can tell us more about this topic. But in the sources that I just read, al-Jassas, al-Tahawi, and the Busi, and the works by Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani, and all of these, we can maybe see very rare places when like Kalam addressed or talk, but in the term that what Suhail Hanif mentioned here, in the term of asl, in terms of this umbrella. So because you cannot address any topic in deen and religion without bringing all of these to your table. So if you're speaking about wudu, you're speaking about masah al-ras. So Hanafi scholar thinking about all chapters, all branches of deen. So bringing something from hudud, from qisas, from maybe riq, and you can see them in maybe in the chapter of wudu, and that's very clear in Kitab al-Hujjah by Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani, as diagram, as a picture that Suhail Hanif, this amazing picture really, how the Hanafi works is what you said,
horizontal.
Horizontal, yes, horizontal. That's ufuqi. Yes, this is my question. I leave to Suhail to address this question, and then we go over other questions.
I don't know if Junaid is next.
Should I? I mean, I can go very quickly because I don't have a ton to say. So, but in response to Ahmed's question, yeah, I mean, so this is an open question for me. To what extent we're talking about a shared intellectual milieu? I think one of the things that I do find, and this is, just a sense from reading this material, is that the later figures, I've only talked about Kawthari, but there are of course others, do kind of make references and draw upon the earlier ones that I talk about. But it's harder for me for the 19th century figures to really get a sense for any kind of shared commitments. I mean, the commitment is the same, certainly, but the kind of shared points of origin, I guess. And my inclination tends to be to really think about them, to kind of historicize and to think about what they're doing in the context of the place that they are. So I think in the case of Lucknowi, it's a kind of different story because, as I tried to allude to, right, his belonging to this India or South Asian world is actually really determinative in some ways, that and really opens up possibilities for hadith centrism in a way that maybe other places don't. Whereas in someone like Marjani, I think what's going on is kind of entirely different, as far as I can tell. There are moments in the texts where you see similar language used, which really opens up the possibility that they're reading each other, perhaps. But I haven't really investigated that in too much detail. Yeah, I'll let Suhail go.
There was just one question in the Q&A by Omar Anshasi on whether you have thought about kind of the relationship of these 19th century hadith scholars to kind of Mamluk, late Mamluk or Hanafi hadith scholars like al-Aini, for example.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I see Omar's mentioned that he missed a little bit. So I did try to kind of allude to this, and I actually don't have a clear sense of the precise relationship between them. I think it is really something that needs to be studied. One doesn't find in the figures that I've looked at kind of clear appropriations of those figures, whether they're Mamluk or whether, as Suhail has talked about, kind of Ottoman period. I don't see those. You do get a kind of general kind of approval of. Can people still hear me? I think I cut out. Did I cut out? Okay, you do get a general approval of figures like Ibn al-Humam, and so there is that sort of general sense, but a very clear, and I would also fall back on the answer that I gave earlier, which is that my tendency, especially in the later periods, is really to think in terms of the context in which these authors are writing, not that just the theological context, but that has to do with social kind of developments and political developments and so on. And so I would be inclined, let's say my initial inclination would be to try to draw a distinction between them, but of course that still needs to be sort of investigated.
Thank you very much. I'll just jump in then. On Dr. Shamsi's question on theology, I don't have much to add to what Dr. Isam said. I don't work so much in the theological tradition. All I can say is in the period that I do work on, what I've been trying to stress today is there are particular fundamental theological premises in the legal tradition. And I believe they're not just theorized in Usul al-Fiqh. I believe they are actually implicit in the legal cases transmitted from Abu Hanifa. And that's why the main one really is to do with husn and qubh and the mind's ability to relate to this, because that obviously was the core of my presentation today. And that's why I think any Hanafi theological tradition, whether it's Mu'tazilism, Maturidism, it seems to have some of these core features, I think, that are in the law. But beyond that, Hanafism is not a theological tradition, which is why I don't think Maturidism is essential to it. It's a particular development of a theological school, but it's not essential as far as I can see to Hanafism. Sarakhsi, as Zaisal says, the most you can say about him theologically is he is a non-Mu'tazili or an anti-Mu'tazili. It's not clear that he belongs to a particular developed sort of theological school. I have nothing more to add on that point. To Dr. Rami's question, no, I don't think the example he gives undermines the presentation I've given. All I'll say is we have to be really cautious about these convenient summaries of legal theory. The summary you've presented is really about a single legal debate about wine and beer, or nabidh. The Shafi'is extended the ruling, Hanafis didn't. We can't boil this down to one usuli principle. The way the Hanafis present Abu Hanifa's position, why he allowed nabidh, is to do with the fact that there's many salaf reports of many kinds of drinks being drunk. And so what I'm trying to get at, it's a more elaborate sort of conversation than simply about how texts and illas relate. The example that came to my mind to show you that it's not so simple is just the very famous masala that Abu Hanifa allows dealing in riba in the Dar al-Harb, in the non-Muslim territories. That clearly, as you can see, is a rational consideration that has constricted the very explicit Quranic text on this point. So there's no simple rule you can come up with about text and mind. It's the most, what we have to do, unfortunately, is the harder work of looking at the entire network of theory, i.e. the entire chapter of Qiyas, and really its place in the entire Usul, and then really what I believe is really the entire presentation of legal theory. And what you'll find is that reasons, or if I can say it simply, reasons and nas, they'll have a relation where at times the nas is above the reason, necessarily so. That's why Qiyas came before the Quran, because you will never arrive at the reason except through the law. There's no direct access to God outside of his revelation. So reason will always be below the text. But the assumption is the text is meaningful. That's what my second part of my quotations were about. There's some reason above the text, which is why the text came as it did. And we, below the text, have to figure out that reason in order to have fiqh in the law. So there's no simple ordering. As for the Hanafi rejection of Sirah, maybe I want to pass that back to Dr. Isam. I don't think he got a chance to answer that. Hanafi scholars who have rejected things in the Sirah. I don't know if you want to add anything on this, Dr. Isam.
Yes, so just I answer Dr. Ahmed Shamsi question, and I leave to answer Dr. Ahmed, but you did not, unfortunately, you did not add anything. I hope, I wish that you add this, a very important question. So, but for Mutasar Zaman and Asad Zaman question, yes. So I'd like to mention two things very important. So in like Kitab al-Hujjah and Fadl al-I'tizal and Kitab Qabul al-Akhbar, we can witness many hadiths, many reports maybe considered in the eyes of muhaddis, maybe not weak, fabricated hadith, right? So it seems like for them, outside fiqh or outside kalam, so all hadith accepted. There's no any problem with hadith. All athar, disconnected or unconnected athar, so is accepted in both Hanafi and Mu'tazilite. So like for Mu'tazilite, Fadl al-i'tizal, al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar in Fadl al-i'tizal cited hadith that mean saying that in the coming centuries, a man coming to the world, his name Wasil bin Ata, yasil bayn al-haq wa yafsil bayn al-batil. So the hadith like narrated by al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar. So that's mean like for Qadi Abdul Jabbar and Mu'tazilite, so all hadith outside of Usul al-Kalam, so no contradiction with Usul al-Kalam, accepted, no problem. And same for Hanafi schools. We can see like many hadiths accepted, and Hanafi accused by these accepting, by approving these hadiths, like hadith al-Qahqaha. Hadith is da'if. You know that these hadiths da'if, and Hanafi accused by this acceptance. But for Hanafi school, it's not about authenticity. It's about all hadith should be accepted unless hadith contradict with Usul al-Kalam. And Usul here, I'm referring to what Dr. Suhail mentioned, is about this al-Asl al-Jami'. Is Kawthari technical terms to depict Sharh Mushkil al-Athar and Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar for by al-Tahawi. Al-Asl al-Jami' can be like translated as the universal canon that you can witness, you can see in all chapters, in all abwab, fiqh and kalam and deen. So in this context, yes. So if we go to Kitab al-Hujjah, we can see maybe many incidents and many places. Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani maybe criticized some hadiths related to seerah, related to tarikh, related to adab, related to akhlaq, related to many issues, not to fiqh. But here, I think how we can approach that, because there is something like Usuliyin wrote or presented, said مقدمة الواجب or مقدمة الحرام. There is a core for wajib, a core for haram, but there is introduction, gates for wajib. And same for Hanafi school. So there is fiqh. So here is fiqh, here legal rulings, but there is gates to these legal rulings. Could be ethics, could be seerah, could be tarikh, could be many issues. So if that's all of these disciplines related to fiqh, then this hadith criticized. And then we can see like some hadith criticized in Kitab al-Hujjah related to tarikh, or related to seerah, or related to ethics, or related to maybe some issues, social issues. But why criticize? Because there is a connection between the subject matter in fiqh and these issues. So my recommendation for all people studying Hanafism and Hadith, people read Kitab al-Hujjah. Kitab al-Hujjah is a very important book to maybe to rethink about the history, Hadith, Kalam, and Fiqh, and especially about geographical places. And this book is a very important. Unfortunately, the edition of this book is very poor, and I don't know if just I'm waiting for al-Kawthari and other mention some manuscripts here and there, but no one traced these manuscripts. I don't know if anyone knows about the history of the book, or like if there's any manuscript right now edited. Yeah, this is my answering. And the last question by Ibrahim about Sunnah al-Mujma' alayha. I'm not aware about this technical terms of Malik when you said Sunnah al-Mujma' alayha. Do you mean al-amal? I'm not sure. So where we can see this technical terms. So Sunnah al-Mujma' alayha, yes, we see it in Kitab al-Jassas and all Kutub al-Usuliyin, al-Ahnaf, but in Malik bin Anas, just if you can maybe explain more.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the particular phrase. I mean, of course, there's al-amr al-mujtama' alayhi عندنا, but that's not necessarily related to sunnah. There's like a sunnah alladhi la ikhtilafa fiha.
Right. So like a sunnah al-mujma' alayha as a technical term, I don't know. This like something I did not witness with Maliki sources. But al-amr, al-amal, yes, but not sunnah.
I mean, just one comment. I mean, I've made this comment for a talk that Assam gave 2 weeks ago at Harvard. I just want to share this now with a question about history. That one argument that I found the Hanafis make that was fascinating to me, Shaybani and Sarakhsi make, is that the account of the collection of the Quran that normally ends with Uthman, Uthman ibn Affan, the third caliph, burning the non-canonical copies of the Quran. The Hanafis reject the historicity of this because they have a sense of what fire means. You know, treating something with fire. That using fire against something is a disrespectful way of using of treating that thing. And Uthman couldn't have done this given his known love for the Quran, right? So I mean, I think there we're getting into the kind of dangers that people get, the kind of fears that they get when they encounter this methodology of Hadith criticism, which is that, well, you're just constructing a world that is consistent, but that might actually bulldoze kind of historical events, right? By your own drive to consistency, by your very kind of narrow perceptions of consistency. But that's enough of Shafi'i propaganda for today. We're here for we're here for your questions. There's another question in the Q&A from Amir Abu Ghudda. I don't know whether that's a real name or just for the occasion of this talk. Hanafis reject a hadith if it contradicts inductively acquired usul. Why don't the Hanafis just consider the hadith a mukhassis of the asl? That is, why doesn't the hadith become its own standalone asl that particularizes inductively acquired usul? Suhail, I think that's your...
Just really, really briefly, the question is not about accepting and rejecting hadiths because they're hadiths. The question is the universal problem across Islamic law. How do you know that a hadith is reliable? How do we have a preponderance in the assumption that the Prophet actually said this? So the hadith scholars have a method to do with chains and narrators and so on. And the fuqaha, the method of that are presented today, is also a method for the same purpose. And what's the essential features of the method? It's that if we can see the salaf practice, well-known jurists before Abu Hanifa practiced this report, accepted it, then that's enough for us to have to give preponderance to the fact that the hadith must have been said. And if there's no such practice, then we don't know now what to do with this report. So then what they say is, okay, we'll see, does it fit into what we know God to have revealed? Does it fit into what we know of God's law? If it does fit, then we have preponderance. The Prophet probably could have said it. Let's do something about it. And if there's no conceivable fit, then the preponderance says no. Why would we have no reason to believe this is likely to have been said? So that's all. So it's not about preferring mind over hadith. It's trying to come up with a way to give preponderance to whether this report actually was uttered by the Prophet. That's all. So I think you have to look at it that way. And I think that addresses your question.
Thank you very much. Apparently, Amir Abu Ghudda is actually a descendant of Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda. So welcome and thank you for joining us. There's another... do we have other questions? Isam, did you still have an answer in, or are you done with the...
Yeah, I think so. I just like one question to everyone, just by Jaz Badshah. Yeah. So where later Hanafi, I think, so Dr. Suhail, this like your area. Do you see the question?
I think it's all your area, Dr. Isam. I'm just coming in to talk a little bit within your area.
Yeah, it's like because like talking about the wisdom of divine law, please, I think he is waiting an answer from you.
So all I can say, based on Dr. Isam's presentation, based on what I've also presented, is this appears to me, to the best of my understanding, the fundamental activity of Abu Hanifa's circle. I did an article recently, it was a bit of an experimental article as well, to say, it was a bit of a strange premise. Can you call Abu Hanifa the founder of Islamic law? And obviously I said, yes, I think you could claim this. But the way I went about it was to study the questions. Abu Hanifa seems to have inaugurated a period of creating questions, actually creating a discipline of law. The nature of his questions and the nature of Shafi'i's questions, if you study them, you get a sense of what they're doing. All I'll say is, sorry, not to go in a long direction, it appears that a lot of the polemics against Abu Hanifa was, yes, he was creating questions, what-if scenarios, exactly to then talk about the meaning of the law. Muhammad ibn Hassan's short works, Jami' al-Saghir, Jami' al-Kabir, were just puzzles of legal cases juxtaposed to create a community of interpretation, which can then think about why this and why that. So the question of the why is as old as Abu Hanifa's legal cases, as far as I can see. And so I don't think you can call this influence. After that, sure, you know, the language or the idiom in legal theory, yeah, that obviously legal theory texts will influence each other in their idiom. If you read Sarakhsi's Usul just at the glance, it's just like any other Usul work. There's asl, there's fara', there's illa, all the terms are there. But you have to kind of go beyond the terms, and then you realize there's a different tradition at play. So my full conviction, as far as all the evidence shows, is no, this is the nature of the cases. All that might be influenced is a particular idiom of presentation. That's my answer personally. I don't know if Dr. Edu wants to give an alternative.
Yeah, that's good. If there is just time, I think there is another comment by Muntasir, this to Dr. Suhail, if there is time, Dr. Ahmed.
All I can say really quickly, sorry, I have not worked with that text, so I can't answer that question. If somebody else wants to say something.
Okay, we will get to this some other time. Until then, please join me in thanking our presenters for their wonderful presentations and for their thoughtful answers. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, all of you, taking time during the day to join us and join us again for future talks. And thank you very much. And I'll shut down the broadcast right now. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.